going on, Team OnCore? Got a really exciting guest here today, Jim Venetos. Jim is the founder of a revolutionary universal and non-conventional golf system that empowers golfers to play the game far better than they could have imagined. For nearly 30 years, he's been teaching and turning 30 handicappers into 16s, 16s into sixes, sixes into scratches. Certainly would love to become one of those students, Jim. His students have set course records, qualified for multiple U.S. amateur and U.S. senior amateur events, and won countless Golden State Tour events, played on the nationwide tour. Jim, welcome to the OnCore podcast.
Thank you, Steve. Happy to be here.
And for our listeners watching the video feed, you're in Southern California, right?
I am. Near Joshua Tree.
Looks beautiful.
It is.
Yeah. Well, in Buffalo, we've got 30-degree weather and some snowflakes today, so I'm definitely jealous. But you know, in doing some research on your teaching and your philosophy, you definitely have a disruptive, unconventional approach, and excited to get into that with listeners. In the opening bio on you, we mentioned you know, your students and the accomplishments they've had. One of the ones that stood out to me, being a fan, was Larry David, which a lot of our listeners will probably know, and be excited to learn a little bit about you know, how that came about and what it was like, you know, teaching Larry.
Well, I can tell you this: he's one of the sweetest and kindest and funniest people I've ever met, and he was actually a really great student. And it's because in the system that I teach, I ask the students to disregard the movements for their hands and arms and set their body in a position that's going to cause the hands and arms to move properly. And so very quickly, he was happy to disregard the movements of his hands and arms. He actually said, "You mean I don't have to worry about it?" I said, "No, you hold the position, you hold your weight still." And so very quickly, he started to exhibit high level versions of the swing that I teach. And so he was a great student. I worked with him for a whole summer, and he had a significant improvement and was thoroughly enjoying the game. And it was fun for me to teach him, not only because he was a good student, but just because he was such a great guy.
What do you think he plays to handicap wise these days?
I think he goes anywhere from like an 8 to a 13, 14, something like that in there. And, you know, we went out and played Riviera a few times when I was teaching him, and he broke 40 on nines and was really playing some lovely golf. Yeah, he was really deadly with his wedges, which was something that starts to happen for all my students right off the bat. You know, I look at the bag as a progression. You know, oftentimes people rush to hit driver. I teach my students to start with short irons, then work into mid irons, then work into your long irons and woods. And so right off the bat, he had his short irons down. So he was pretty deadly from inside of 120 yards.
And we're going to get into your approach, but can you maybe give listeners a sense of your background in golf and how you came to see some deficiencies with how you thought the game was being taught, and just kind of give us a little bit about that journey?
Sure. It's been quite a journey. So I started playing when I was 9, and I was playing competitively by 10. In Southern California, we have this great junior golf association. And so as I'm growing up, I'm competing against Tiger and Phil and a lot of other household names on tour, and a lot of the guys that nobody ever heard of that were really remarkable golfers too. And so my goal, I dedicated my whole life to playing competitive golf, and then from there teaching it and sharing the message. So as I was younger and really studying the game, I was fortunate enough to be taught by some really high level instructors. And I just felt that what they were teaching didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And it was also very difficult to perform. So at a pretty young age, I think it was my senior year in high school, I turned my back on traditional instruction. And I just started to work off of this concept. I knew what type of ball flight I wanted to have for a stock shot. I wanted to hit a solid tight draw as my stock shot that was powerful and efficient and predictable and had good misses. And so I set a form that would create that function. It's form follows function. And that's basically how I came about it. I worked off a ball flight, And then I started to realize that there were some consistencies in the body that would allow me to reproduce consistent solid tight draws if I could set my body in a position that would influence that. You know, setup determines so much in life. And so it was just something where I and my students, we do the work in the setup instead of doing the work during the swing. So we preset the movements for an efficient swing in the setup, and that allows for a much more enjoyable experience during the swing, because all you have to do is focus on keeping your weight still instead of managing the movements of the swing. So early on, it was something I just turned my back on traditional instruction. And then when I started teaching at Wilshire Country Club in Los Angeles, which I was very fortunate to get that opportunity. I was 22 years old. And from my very first lesson, I thought to myself, you know, if I struggled with traditional instruction and I found flaw in it, and I can execute the traditional swing fine, it would just be that one time a tournament where the swing would let me down. All of a sudden I go from 4 or 5 under par to, you know, 1 or 2 under par, and it's like, what just happened? So because of that, when I started teaching, I thought, you know, the average golfer hasn't dedicated near as much time or have near the golf athleticism that I had. So how could they possibly benefit from traditional instruction? So from a very first lesson, I still remember it clear as day. I asked the student to preset the position in his setup. And prior to that, he was hitting these weak slices, and he presets the position in the setup. Then I asked him just to keep his weight still, and he smokes this tight little draw. And it looked just like my ball flight too. This was the thing that was interesting for me is, you know, my students have taught me so much. And that was where it started to happen, where I started to realize that my students could do what I do in the swing, regardless of my experience.
And when you mention universal swing methodology, can you maybe just explain what you mean about that?
Sure. So the swing I teach is just based upon the geometry of your anatomy relative to the task at hand. So if you really look into the body works in very specific ways. There are ways that it should move and there's ways that it shouldn't move. And you can organize yourself in a way in the setup so that you can hit these quality shots. And, you know, in a lot of golf instruction, they talk about each golfer must find his own swing based upon his body type. So that could be age, flexibility, coordination, skill level, gender, that kind of stuff. I think our body type is human. And so I don't think that there should be a different swing for each body type. Instead, we all have 206 bones, and if you organize yourself properly, those bones are all going to work very similarly, which is why you see, if you watch, you know, the Olympics and you see sprinters running down the track, they all look the same. One's faster than the other, but they're running very similar because they're using their anatomy in the same way. So that was something that I found, is that I could put students into a position that just mimics my anatomy, since they have the same anatomy, and they can execute the same type of swing and get really high quality shots.
Well, I think too, with Bryson DeChambeau utilizing the kind of, you know, single length shaft throughout the bag and kind of the single plane Mo Norman type swing, there's a renewed interest in these different swing methodologies. Can you maybe explain how your swing might be a little bit different than, say, what Bryson's doing for our listeners?
I'd say Bryson is pretty similar when it comes down to it. So one thing that's true of tour players and all great ball strikers, they use their lead side in a dominant way. So that would either be a strong grip, or that'll be something where they don't shift their weight much, or they start from a slightly closed position, or they return to a slightly closed position at impact. Those are all indicators that you're using your lead side in a dominant way. So all your top ball strikers on tour actually use their lead side in a dominant way. And this is often why they're also not the best putters on tour, because putting comes from your trail side. So you have a lot of guys out there like a Fred Couples, right? Remarkable ball striker, really strong grip, doesn't move his weight much, doesn't swing hard. He's using his lead side in a dominant way throughout the swing, but he's also using his lead side to putt. So he's not a very good putter because it's not the ideal dynamic. It puts the wrong kind of spin on the ball. So with Bryson or with Mo Norman, you know, if you think about how Mo Norman set the club, right? When he started in his setup position, the club was 1.5 feet to the right of the ball and to the inside of the ball. Well, what that does is it closes your body. And so what I teach people to do is to close their body down in the setup. So Mo, actually, when I listen to Mo speak, which is, you know, I totally admire any opportunity to listen to what he had to say, he used his lead side in a dominant way throughout the swing. And he talks about it in a very abstract way, but it's, when it comes down to it, he used his lead side in a dominant way. And I think so is Bryson. I think he's got a lot of similar qualities to what it is that I teach. But the thing is that's important to remember is I'm teaching the general population of golfers who don't have the same skill set as PGA Tour players. And so the setup position I teach is more magnified for the general population because it helps them to essentially counter whatever they might lack in talent. So by starting in a deeper setup position, it puts them in a safer position to be able to execute a proper swing.
How different would your lesson be for a more advanced player versus a beginner, intermediate? Is that forward weight methodology, front side weight? Is that universal from a scratch golfer to a beginner, or do you have to kind of modify your approach?
No. The technique is the same. It's just that the more advanced golfer has actually experienced this type of strike. So guys on tour, they hit out of their lead side all the time. If they need to hit a draw, whether or not they can put it into words and teach it, the really high skill level golfers are able to hit this shot. It's just they also do other things during the swing to create different variations. I have found that if you just get into your lead side and you keep your weight still, you can not only hit this type of shot, but you can hit any type of shot. You can hit high fades, you can control trajectory, you can control spin, you can work the ball, and it all comes from that. So when I'm teaching a higher skill level, like I got one student that's a +5 to +7 handicap, and I played with him for 5 years. I saw this all firsthand, and I watched his growth. You know, we get to speak a different lexicon because of our experience, but the technique is still the same. So I might say something to a good player like, hey, you know how you hit that knockdown wedge from 95 yards and it takes one hop and stop and has that kind of spin on it and you're just keeping your weight heavy on your front foot and your hands are really dead? And they'll say, yeah, I hit that shot all the time. And I'll say, now I want you to do that with driver. And they'll do it with driver, and sure enough, they get this really robust and powerful result. And it's this realization of, oh, wow, I could do that for any type of shot that I want to hit from that premise of presetting your weight and presetting your swing path.
When I watched a number of your videos, and for our listeners, I think you've got a great collection on YouTube for those to become familiar with, you know, with the swing and your teachings. Highly suggest you check out Jim on his YouTube. It seemed like a lot of the shots that you were hitting at least were more draw oriented, and in my mind I'm watching the swing and I'm thinking, yep, that's producing a draw, you know, a draw ball flight. And even in some of your literature, I know you mentioned that. Of course, then I just heard you say that you can hit all different types of shots. You know, I know from watching the tour guys, you know, the fade, you know, a fade off the driver seems to be really popular these days, where it's more, you know, something you can control more. So maybe just talk about that, you know, that tendency, at least from the videos I saw, for the swing to produce a draw versus, you know, what you mentioned about being able to hit any kind of shot.
So it's all about spin. So a good player is always trying to control the spin on his ball, and you want to have a reduced amount of spin on the ball. The less the ball spins, the farther it's going to go, and the less it's going to spin offline. So a 2-yard draw and a 2-yard fade are not mirror images of each other. The 2-yard fade has more spin on it. That's why it flies a little higher. That's why it might land a little softer. A useful shot when necessary, But your stock shot, if it's a draw, now you're handling, you're having a shot that has much less spin on it, and that gives you a lot more control over the ball. So as the stock shot, for example, anybody can hit a fade. Bobby Jones actually says there are times when the expert player needs to hit the ball from left to right. So the expert player will do intentionally what the average golfer does unintentionally, which is basically make a poor swing. So to move the ball from left to right is very easy. It's moving the ball from right to left or in a draw ball flight that is a little more elusive. That's why the general public doesn't typically hit draws. Most of the guys that you play with, sure, they'll hit a fade, and that's what's often done on tour too. But that has a lot to do with me. For me, it has a lot to do with not understanding that there's actually a more efficient shot that could be played. And that's why, all your best ball strikers on tour, they're able to work the ball both directions. The more limited ball strikers are only hitting the ball one direction, and it tends to be a fade.
Makes sense. And I guess it's music to my ears as someone who normally hits a draw. And I've always thought the opposite, that a fade would be more easy to control. So that's an interesting anecdote on the ball spin characteristics between the two shots.
So to help you, which is really important, so a draw can be difficult to control from your trail foot. If your weight's hanging too far back on your back foot, then the draw is turns into a hook, and it becomes far less productive, and it's not what I'm talking about. But from your lead foot, that draw is a shot that behaves really well, and it's something that you can communicate to it with. Like, I was invited down to the Titleist Performance Institute, maybe 12 years ago, by the founders, and that was because one of my students went down there for a fitting, and he was a 56-year-old man who was a member at the club, and he had performed so well, and his ball flight dynamics were so efficient that they wanted to know where he learned this from. So they invited me down to have a powwow with him. And we went, and it was a 4-hour discussion. And I walked in, and I said, gentlemen, I'm coming from the point of view that the traditional swing is flawed. And this is evidenced by the tour pros' inconsistency and the average player's inadequacy. And so we have this whole back and forth about ball flight and spin on the ball. And it came down to just understanding that, the draw does have less spin, and that's what set off their red flags on their dynamics as they're reading their ball flight dynamics, that made them want to discuss it with me. And they figured at the end, they said, well, you're the perfect pro to teach how to hit a draw, because we've never seen a draw like that.
For our listeners that might be more visual learners, hearing us talk about it, it might be challenging for them to really digest the swing and put it into practice. What is the best way for them to learn about your teaching and begin to try it out for themselves?
Yeah, well, I got an online school. It's a completely comprehensive school that's a linear learning path, and it basically takes you by the hand as soon as you sign up, and it leads you to where the goals that you want to achieve. And the majority of my students far surpass their goals. And I'm there to guide you through the whole process, through swing video analysis, and then also all of the curriculum in the school. And it's been great. I've been teaching remotely now for 7 years. And it's, with the whole pandemic that's occurred, it's really been kind of interesting for me to watch, because it's been better for my students to have these lockdown situations, because they've been forced to stay at their home and actually build fundamentals. And that's something that I'm always begging my students to do. Don't go rush to the course and play. Let's build fundamentals. If you're going to learn how to play an instrument, you scales and then notes and then chords and then songs, or whatever the progression might be. So I try to do the same with my students. I build them from small swings, like it would be comparable to shooting layups in basketball, and then expanding on that once they have proper fundamentals. So there's something where my seasonal golfers, or even during this time of lockdown, they have an advantage, because there's no temptation to go out and play. There's no temptation to go out and hit driver. So if you really love the game, you want to work on the game, you start to work on these fundamentals. And that's how the school works. It progresses from the basic fundamentals, and at the end, like I said, I got one student that's a +7, and it'll teach you every shot that you need to hit to be able to shoot consistently under par.
Well, that's a great segue. In Buffalo, where we are in our off season at the moment, and I wanted to ask you what kinds of tips for our listeners who might also be, um, you know, at home thinking about, spring season. What can they be doing? You know, obviously, taking your course is number one. But are there training aids? Should they have putting mats? What are some things we should be thinking about in our off season, or even as you mentioned, those listeners that might be under kind of a quarantine type order?
Yeah, one thing that's fun for me is because my students will send me videos, they'll send them from their basement, from their backyard, from their garage, from the local park where they're just hitting balls. So I get to see, and it's really inspiring for me because you get to see how much people love the game and how far they're willing to go to try and work on their game. And it doesn't take much. You really don't need a golf course to build fundamentals. And something that I often reference to my students when it comes to seasonal golfers, Kobe Bryant, right? During the off season, he would work so hard on his game, and he would spend the entire off season developing moves, shots, additional skills, and he wouldn't implement them until he spent the whole off season doing it. And it'd be something like, oh, Kobe comes back this year and all of a sudden he's shooting with his left hand more. Well, it's because he was putting up 1,000 jumpers a day with his left hand so that he could build that skill. So there's a great advantage to having an off season where you actually can work on fundamentals. Now with the traditional swing, the fundamentals are kind of vague because there is no universal swing. There is no universal format or template. And that's something that's really fun for me, is because I have a format, because I have a template, students can actually build proper fundamentals that then produce good results once it's all said and done. A lot of people don't like to practice, and I totally understand that. When I was a kid, I didn't particularly like to practice much either, because as I was practicing traditional theory, I would find that it was always kind of like a roll of the dice when it came down to it. But then once I started to understand what it is that I teach and what it is that I use for my swing, I learned that I could build fundamentals, things that you can count on, and that's because of this. I teach you how to focus on not moving. The core, the source for what produces our action is a focus on staying still. Well, staying still is something that's finite. You stay still, and you're going to produce good results. Movements are not infinite, but there's many more ways to move than there are to stay still. And so when students practice with my system, when they focus on stillness, it's very easy to take their skills from the range to the course, because they just stay still, whether it's on the range or on the course, and they're going to produce those results. You mentioned training aids. I'm not a big fan of training aids. Yes, you should have a putting mat. Yes, you should definitely have a net. But when it comes to gimmicky training aids, if those worked, I probably wouldn't have a job. Instead, I look at the anatomy as your training aid. This is your format. This is your template. And if you arrange your anatomy properly, well, then that's something that you own. It's something that you take to the course with you. It's something that you're very familiar with. And so I think the best training aid is actually understanding that it's you, your physical structure, your skeleton. And when you understand how to preset the movements for the swing, it all becomes very simple to use your anatomy to be a very consistent and pretty high quality golfer.
Great advice. I had an instructor growing up who used to say, students really want consistent swings, repeatable swings, and his counterpoint to that was, golf is kind of an inconsistent game in the sense that you never have the same shot. The lie, the weather, the course, the conditions are always changing. So, I always remember him saying that. Um, how would you kind of speak to that notion of, the dynamics are always evolving, but we do, as golfers, we do kind of crave that, dependability, consistency, repeatability in our swings.
Yeah, he's absolutely right. There are many variables in the game, and the game is difficult because of all the shots that you're faced with. So I suggest, why add variables by having all these extra movements in your swing, making it not only difficult to execute the swing off of a flat lie, but then you get onto all kinds of varied lies and it becomes even more difficult. So what I do for my students is we shed away all the unnecessary and we get down to what matters. So that way the variables have been limited. Now, yes, the game is still hard. The hole is small and it's very far away and there's many hazards on the way to get the ball in there. But actually swinging the club doesn't have to be hard if you apply this system. It's really just about removing all the unnecessary so that you have a chance to perform as consistent as possible. And as you mentioned, consistency, to be consistent has a lot to do with your focus as much as it does with your physical ability. And I think you would know, and I'm sure your listeners, golfers focus on different things. They have different swing thoughts and tips that they're pursuing all the time. So if your focus, if what you're telling yourself to do during the swing is inconsistent, then it would be very hard to become a consistent golfer. But if you're always telling yourself to do the same thing, which is, I have my students, I have them keep their weight still and hold their position, hold the closed position of their body through impact. So that's something that's very consistent. And every day that they pursue it, they get better at it, physically producing it and also understanding why it produces good results. So I really think that consistency first starts with your focus. If your focus is consistent, well, now you have a chance to at least produce some consistency. And then if you can remove a bunch of variables in the swing that are reliant upon you moving properly and having rhythm, tempo, and timing, well, then things even get better. The glue for the traditional swing is rhythm, tempo, and timing. And that's because they're trying to balance all the movements throughout the swing. The glue for my swing is keep your weight still. It's something that's more concrete and more tangible. And it's something that I found for myself. It wasn't like I was trying to revolutionize the golf swing. I was looking for myself after I received a lot of good instruction and I felt like, I want something better for me. I want to be able to work the ball more consistently. I want to have more power. So it's just a simple understanding that, maybe the golf swing and instruction isn't completely evolved yet. And if you look at the average golfer and how the average golfer struggles, that's pretty good indication that maybe, just maybe, we could find out a better way to be able to control the ball. And if you can control it through stillness as opposed to movement, imagine it's an easier task.
What would be the best way for our listeners to reach you, to learn more? Because I do feel it's a fascinating approach, disruptive, and something that I'd love for them to be able to check out firsthand.
Yeah, I have a website. That's my online school. It's jimvenetosgolfacademy.com. And I could be reached at my email, which is jim@jimvenetosgolfacademy.com. And, nothing gives me more joy than being able to share what I've learned over 40 years of playing the game competitively and dedicating my life to it, to be able to share it with other golfers that love the game so much so that they can enjoy it too. It's so much of golf is surrounded around the frustrated golfer. And I don't think that has to be a thing. The game is difficult, but the swing doesn't have to be difficult anymore.
Well, we appreciate you coming on the OnCore podcast, Jim, and our listeners, I know they're excited to learn more. So thank you for coming on and sharing your insights.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Take care.
Thank you.